Look at this fruit. Isn't it beautiful? You wish you would have this in your hand right now as you are looking at it. Now my question is to you, how did we get this huge beautiful fruit? It is because of pollination. Now what is pollination? Pollination is nothing but transfer of pollen grain from the anther onto the stigma. That means we are transferring pollen grain which is produced in the anther and onto the stigma, which will eventually reach the egg. Now before we go further into the concept of pollination, let us recall to our memory the floral reproductive organs, that is male and female floral reproductive organs. Now female reproductive organs consist of carpel or pistil. Now this pistil or carpel has got stigma, style and ovary, and inside the ovary we have ovules. Therefore we already know the function of stigma, style and ovary. Then we have male reproductive organ, that is stamen, and this stamen consists of anther and filament, and inside the anther we have pollen grain. So therefore we have male gamete and we have female gamete. Now they are not in the same place. Now if you want to get the fruit, you should bring these two gametes together, and the process of bringing these together is called as pollination. Now how does this pollination take place? Pollination can take place either by self-pollination or cross-pollination. Self-pollination means it is within the self. That means within the flower itself. It is selfish. It does not interact with the other flowers. All business is taking place within same flower. And therefore, the plants that exhibit this self-pollination mainly produce two types of flowers. One is chasmogamous flower and clistogamous flower. What does chasmogamous flower means? Chasmogamous flowers means they are like any other normal flower with exposed stamen and stigma. That means they are called open flowers. Whereas clistogamous flowers means they are closed flowers. That means we don't see the anther and the stigma. All are enclosed within, and therefore forcibly that it has to undergo self-pollination, because there is no other way of interacting with the other. And therefore these two types of flowers are produced in plants like oxalis and commelina. These are the two examples you can remember. These two plants undergo self-pollination, and these two plants produce this chasmogamous flower and clistogamous flowers. Now in self-pollination, this self-pollination can be autogamy or geitonogamy. Autogamy means transfer of pollen grain from the anther onto the stigma of the same flower. That means there is one flower, in that there are stamens and there is stigma. What happens? The anther produces pollen grains, and that pollen grain will fall on the stigma of that same flower and fertilization takes place. And this is one way. Another way is that is called as a geitonogamy. That is, anther produces pollen grain in one flower, and these pollen grains are transferred to another flower. But remember, that flower is also on the same plant, not different plant, but on the same plant. The only difference between this autogamy and geitonogamy is, in the first part, both anther and stigma are from the same flower, whereas in geitonogamy, anther and stigma are from different flowers, but both of them are present, both the flowers are present on the same plant. And therefore, this is the difference that we should have. Now, the geitonogamy appears to be cross-pollination, because Pollen from one flower is being transferred to another flower. Technically you can call it as cross pollination, but genetically it is self pollination because the same genes are transferred, because both the flowers are on the same plant, and therefore we will not get any genetic variability, and therefore it is self pollination. Let us now look at what is cross pollination. Cross means crossing from one place to another, and here what happens, the pollen that is produced in one flower is transferred to the stigma of another flower, and this flower is present on entirely different plants, and therefore such transfer of pollen grain is termed as cross pollination. Now since the pollen is traveling a long distance from its origin to its destination, it requires some help, and those who help in this process are called as agents of pollination. The agents are nothing but the agents who carry out this pollination of transfer of pollen grain onto the stigma. Now there are mainly two categories among these agents. One is abiotic and biotic. Abiotic means these are non-living things which take part in cross pollination. Non-living means we have mainly wind and water, and pollination by wind is called as anemophily, and pollination with the use of water is called as hydrophily. Now we have to focus on first on anemophily. The wind pollinated flowers have got special characteristics. First of all, wind is uncertain. We do not know from which side to which side it blows, and there is no guarantee that all the pollen grain will finally go and land upon the stigma, and therefore to overcome this difficulty, what does these plants do? They produce large amount of pollen grain, so that even if 50% or 70% do not reach the destination, at least some 25% may reach the destination. And therefore this is the first characteristic of wind pollinated flowers, that is, they produce large amount of pollen grain. Secondly, these pollen grains are lightweight. That means they are very light in weight because they have to fly in the wind. If they are heavy, they may fall off and fall to the ground, and therefore in order to be carried away by the wind, these pollen grains are very light. And these flowers which are produced, which undergo wind pollination, they do not contain any color, any nectar, because basically color and nectar are used to attract these agents. Now these plants need not attract wind, because wind comes and wind goes. It does not wait for anybody, and therefore there is no use of having color or nectar, and therefore these are colorless and nectarless. And then in this type of flowers, the flowers are packed into an inflorescence, because these are very tiny flowers. Wind pollinated flowers are very small, and therefore in order that pollination happens properly, these tiny flowers pack up and they get packed into an inflorescence, and thus pollination takes place. Then also these flowers will have feathery stigma. This will have feathery stigma. Why? Because when the wind is carrying pollen grain, if the feathery stigma is there, it can catch the pollen grain which are passing by, and thus bring about fertilization. Therefore, this type of pollination is seen mainly in grasses, that means in grass family, all the grasses, and one grass we can remember is maize. If you look at maize, you will understand the female flower of the maize, telling what? Long tassels like this, and therefore that is a feathery stigma in order to catch the pollen grain. And therefore these are few characteristics that we find in wind pollinated flowers, and therefore this is very important. They will ask you the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers, and therefore understand properly. After anemophily, we have hydrophily. Here, water is the agent of pollination. Now, this takes place in aquatic plants. But remember, not all aquatic plants undergo hydrophily. Even though they may be in water, but not all undergo this hydrophily. There are only few which are submerged plants which undergo this hydrophily. Example, we have the Vallisneria and Hydrilla in fresh water and Zostera in seawater. And therefore, these two examples we must study. Now, how does this hydrophily takes place now, how does this pollination takes place in water in case of Vallisneria? Now, Vallisneria are submerged plants. Now, these submerged plants, what happens during the fertilization? The female stigma, the flower, from the female flower, the stigma grows upward and reaches the surface of the water. That means the stigma is almost on the surface of the water. Once the stigma reaches the surface of the water, the male flower, which is submerged inside the water, once the anther is matured and pollen grains are ready, pollen grains are released. Now these pollen grains, they float and come up on the surface of the water, and through the water current, they may come and reach the stigma. Not all will reach. It is by luck, and therefore whichever reaches the stigma and the further process takes place. And therefore in Vallisneria, the female flower, it sends out the stigma along with the style, and the stigma reaches the surface of the water, and then female flower releases the pollen grain, and this pollen grain come up with the water current, and then in the flow they may reach the stigma and fertilization takes place. This is in fresh water. Whereas in Zostera, that is seagrass, that means huge grass, these are submerged. Here what happens? The female flowers, the stigma does not come up onto the surface, it remains submerged under the water. Whereas the male flower, it produces pollen grains, and these pollen grains are long and slender. And therefore, these long slender pollen grains, according to the water current, they start flowing and they will reach the stigma, and therefore it is underground. And therefore, in both the cases, in Vallisneria and in Zostera, the probability of fertilization is very less. It is always by luck, and thus in Vallisneria and Zostera, this pollination takes place by using water, and therefore this process, entire process, is called as hydrophily.